Hi, I'm Jen from Jimmy Beans Wool, and today I want to teach you a little bit about increases. I want you to know from the very beginning that I won't be demonstrating the actual techniques for how to work them. If you need to know how to do a yarn over or a make one, there are other videos on our site that will show you how to actually do the technique. What I'd like to do is help you compare when you would use one increase versus another increase in a pattern, so that if you are changing what the designer wrote or designing on your own, you have an idea of why something might be called for or why you might want to change it, and some different situations in which to use different ones. The first yarn over I want to talk about, or the first increase I want to talk about, is the yarn over. And most people forget to think of it as an increase because it's so decorative. But it is an increase. And so this is what it looks like in a swatch, and you're probably all very familiar with the nice, pretty lacy holes that it leaves when you knit with it. And basically, when to use it or not to use it comes down to, do you want those pretty lacy holes or not? Are they going to be a design element when they're paired and pretty like this? Or are they going to leave a big gaping hole in one spot in the back of your sweater or something like that? So if you want open holes, use it as a design detail. If you don't want open holes, don't use a yarn over, use something else. The next one that gets used a lot is knit front and back. And it gets used because it's really easy to do. But there are some situations in which you might want to avoid it. For example, in stockinette stitch, a knit front and back, let me see if I can find it on my swatch here before I turn it around for you, will leave little purl bumps. Because of the way that working through the back stitch works, it will leave little what looks like purl bumps even though you didn't actually purl. And that can offset, especially if you're doing them all the way across a row, that can offset the nice plain flat look of your stockinette stitch, to have these little bumps sticking out periodically throughout the field. There is a way to do it without making that purl bump, and Jeannie has an excellent video on our site for how to do that without making the purl bump on there, so it's worth thinking about that. The other thing I want to make sure that you're aware of, if you are going to use a knit front and back when your pattern has called for something else, like a make one, is that it will increase in a different spot. So if you have something like this that I'm working on here, that has, see this slip stitch texture here? This pattern calls for you to increase on a certain row pretty much every other stitch. And if you replace that make one increase with the knit front and back, this is not going to line up properly. Let me illustrate why here on the table with some visual aids. I'm gonna play cards on the table. If these are your stitches, I have 5 of them, 5 stitches, and your pattern tells you to knit 3 and then increase, make one. You have increased, this is my increase stitch, you have increased between stitch 3, 1, 2, 3, and stitch 4. But if you knit front and back, if you knit 3 and then knit front and back to increase, because the first part of knit front and back is a knit, you actually end up increasing between row 4, or stitch 4, and stitch 5 rather than stitch 3 and stitch 4 like your pattern wants you to. You can easily adjust for that by knitting 2 and then knitting front and back and then continuing on with your pattern to put your increase in the spot that you want it. But it's good to be aware before you do it and mess it up that it's going to change where the actual increase is. Most of the time it doesn't matter. If it's 1 stitch over, it's not going to make a difference. But again, if you're lining up cables or slip stitches or some other design element, it's important to be aware that your increase will be in a different spot, and you might offset those things unintentionally by switching out which increase you're using. So there's that, my very high-tech illustration of why that will move your patterns over one bit. The other increases that are used most commonly are make ones. There are about as many ways to make one as there are knitters on the planet. Everybody does it slightly differently. There are a bajillion million ways to do it, and we all call them make ones. I'm going to only talk about 3 of them today, but a quick Google search will illustrate all of the rest of them for you. The one most everyone is familiar with, and usually the one that comes to mind first when people think of a make one, is the lifted increase, where you're manipulating the bar between 2 stitches. And all of the make ones come paired, that there's a right leaning version right. I know my left from right. A right-leaning version and a left-leaning version, and they're paired. And that's true of the 3 I'm going to talk about as well. But again, I'm not going to demonstrate the techniques. You can find those in other videos. For the lifted increase, it's most commonly used because it's really the cleanest of all 3. Of all of the increases, it is the cleanest. It's the least visible in your fabric. And I've got an example of it right here, if my stuff is not all together. It's this one. Oh no, my tags are sticking. And here we have a nice example where I've done a right and a left, and all of these swatches are going to have been made the same way. So all of the differences are because of the stitch, not because of what I did to knit it. I didn't do any voodoo, I promise. So it's very clean. You can't really see the differences in the stitches. It just increases, and that's why most people use this stitch, because it doesn't show up very well, or it doesn't show up very dramatically. It's nice and clean. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is it can get really tight if you're knitting in the same row, because if you're having to increase a lot of stitches right next to each other, because that yarn gets shared by multiple stitches between, so it can get very tight. So that's something to keep in mind for why you might want to do something different. The other reason, the other instance in which I don't use that one particularly is garter stitch. Let me show you my swatch here for garter stitch. And this is the right side, but if you get in here, you can kind of see that it throws the ridges off. Instead of having a nice clean line along here, it messes, it divots the ridge just a bit so that they don't sit nice and flat like garter stitch generally does. However, if you look at the wrong side of my swatch, a lot of that effect goes away. So a lot of times if I am going to do that type of increase in garter stitch, I just switch it to doing it on the wrong side rows instead of the right side row, which is generally where the pattern will call for it, because it's actually cleaner on the back than it is on the front. Sometimes though, if you're doing a lot of garter stitch, or just don't like that increase, some people find, myself included, that with a really tight gauge or dull needles, it's hard to manipulate that bar. I'm always making a face trying to get in there and get that stitch to stay and then knit it, and sometimes it's fiddly. And there are other things that you can do to get a different result that will still give you an increase, and sometimes, in some cases, like garter stitch, look a little bit neater. One of them is the cast-on increase, where you can do either a backwards loop or a forwards loop, depending on right or left leaning, to get the same increase effect. The pros for this one is it's very, very easy, but in stockinette, it's not quite as neat and clean. Let me show you this swatch here. You can see a little bit more where the increases actually are. There's some, especially if I pull this open, I think you can see the holes through here. Let's see if we can get my shirt or my skin behind it. You can see the holes that correspond to the increases. Because that stitch is cast on and not attached to anything, there is more of an open area between or underneath it, because there wasn't anything there and now you've put a stitch on top of it. Knitting it through the back loop on the next row helps to twist it so that it closes that gap, but it will never close it all the way. So it does show up a little bit more, not a whole lot, and again, when they're paired, you'll see it even less. Also, I have purposefully stacked my increases on top of each other to bias the fabric so that each flaw will show up more in my swatch than it probably would in your pattern, so just so that you can see what that will do. The texture I really like to use that increase for is actually for my for garter stitch, because it doesn't bias the row. So this is the same cast on increase used, and it doesn't cause the purl bumps on the garter stitch to go wonky in the spot of the increase. They actually lay much nicer across. So for garter stitch, I really like to use that one instead. And it was a favorite of Elizabeth Zimmerman, so she knew a lot. It's worth checking out if she says that's how you should do it. Again, though, the wrong side row is just a little bit less neat than the right side row, but not by much. So it's also really good for things that are in garter that are going to be reversible, because if you remember with the lifted increase, one side looks really good, but the other side gets kind of, the right side actually gets kind of biased and wonky. If it needs to be reversible, that cast on method works quite a bit better. For me though, it's very slow, because in order to do the backwards loop or the forwards loop, I have to drop what I was doing over here and wrap it around my finger and then transfer it to the needle. So there's a lot of dropping and picking up for me for how to cast those things on. So when speed is a necessary thing to keep in mind, or I just don't want to do it because it's fiddly, there's another way to do it, which is to do a yarn over on one row and then knit it through the back loop coming back, or to yarn forward, which is slightly different, which will lean the other way. The thing about this one though is it shows up quite a bit. You can see this one here where my gauge was just slightly looser is nice and open. There's a big hole so you can see them, because again you're creating a stitch where there wasn't anything before and you're closing it up on the next round, but it never closes up all the way and doesn't always stay perfectly neat. It is a little bit open, especially if you block open the fabric. You'll see it quite a bit. But in garter stitch, again, it really disappears. That's not the right one. This is the right one. It is a little bit more visible on the right side than the wrong side. This is the right side. Hard to tell sometimes in garter stitch. This one's the right side, but not as visible as the lifted increase in my opinion. So if you're doing a lot of garter, and again it also looks really good and even slightly better I think on the wrong side, and it doesn't bias the fabric in there. You don't mess up your pretty garter ridges by having it go out on you. So that one is there. This is for me a little bit easier to do when you are increasing a lot in the same row, this one and the cast on increase, because you get to use new yarn instead of having to pick up all of that yarn from in between like you would with a lifted bar increase. So you get to have new yarn instead of pulling that really tight and making that next row sort of a pain to knit into because it's going to be so tight. The other thing to keep in mind with the yarn over increase, with where you're knitting it through the back loop on the next row, is if you are forgetful like me and forget to knit it through the back loop on the next row, you're going to just have yarn overs and big gaping holes everywhere. So that's something to keep in mind, as well as how distracted you get while you're knitting. But there's an overview of a few different increases for you for why you might want to switch it out, or why your pattern is calling for something you've never seen before. Perhaps they did exactly that and swatched it all out. Your mileage may vary for what you find neatest and cleanest in your work, what pain you're willing to put up with while you knit versus the finished result. It's all up to you, and what really matters is that you're happy with your knitting when you're done with it. So keep these techniques in mind, but in the end, do whatever makes you feel happy. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Jen from Jimmy Bean's Wool.
Thunder rumbles on this American summer night.